Yugoslavia was a prosperous, independent, socialist nation for decades. After the Soviet Union dissolved, the American empire targeted Yugoslavia for destruction. It had valuable resources and remained the only powerful nation in Europe outside its control. So a major effort began to destabilize that nation and break it into smaller states. A proven method of quietly conquering nations was used in Yugoslavia, as explained in the great 2004 book, Confessions of an Economic Hitman. Author John Perkins provides this short summary.
I think it's fair to say that since the end of World War II, and increasingly in the most recent decades, we have managed to create the world's first truly global empire. And it's the first empire that's been created primarily without the military. It's been created by economic hitmen, by people like what I once was. And we work many different ways, economic hitmen, but perhaps the most common is that we will identify a third world country that has resources our corporations covet, like oil, and then arrange a huge loan to that country from the World Bank or one of its sisters. But the money never goes to the country. Instead, it goes to our big corporations to build infrastructure projects, power plants, highways, industrial parks, things that benefit a few very rich people in that country, as well as our own corporations, but don't help the majority of the people who are too poor to buy electricity, don't have the skills to get jobs in industrial parks, don't own cars to drive on the highways. And yet those very people, the whole country is left holding a huge debt so that it can't pay for education and social services and health care for its people. In fact, the debt is so huge by intent that at some point we economic hitmen go back and we say, listen, you owe us a lot of money. You can't repay your debts, so sell your oil real cheap to our oil companies without regard to the environment. Vote with us on the next critical United Nations vote. Send troops in support of ours to some place in the world like Iraq. And in that way, we've created this empire.
It would take hours to cover all the events that took place over the years to destroy Yugoslavia. Professor Michael Parente wrote a book about this topic.
Yugoslavia, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, was built on an idea, as Ramsey Clark said. Very few countries are actually built on an idea. The idea was that the southern Slavs would not remain weak, divided people falling out among themselves or falling prey to some imperialist outsider. That they would join together and they would have a territory that was large enough and strong enough to become a viable nation with its own development. And sure enough, after World War II, multi-ethnic socialist Yugoslavia was a post-war industrial power, a viable nation, and an economic success. Between 1960 and 1980, it had one of the most vigorous growth rates, a decent standard of living, free medical care and education, guaranteed right to a job, 1 month free vacation with pay is made. They said, well, what we're going to do is continual basic industry, building up the industrial base, heavy industry, and we're also going to increase and improve consumer production. Now, how are we ever going to be able to do both of those things, you see? Very simply, we got the answer. We'll borrow from the West. Well, once they started borrowing, with borrowing from the West came IMF penetration and an enormous debt. With debt came IMF demands for restructuring. Restructuring is a euphemism for a harsh austerity program. You cut back in public sector spending. You cut wages. You cut employment. You abolish worker management enterprises. In other words, you force your people to work harder for less, producing more, consuming less, and with that difference, you pay off your debt schedule, or at least the interest that's accumulating on this wealth. Still, much of the economy was public sector and not for profit, including the very rich reserves of minerals and other natural resources in the province of Kosovo and elsewhere. Then came another blow. What I'm saying to you is that there was a conscious and deliberate plan to fragment and break up Yugoslavia. The other blow was in November of 1990, when President George Bush went to the U.S. Congress and pressured them to pass the foreign appropriations law that called for the cutting off of all aid and credits to Yugoslavia. Trading without credits can be a disaster, especially for a country that doesn't have a hard currency, and this had a devastating effect on the country. The law also demanded that if any republic in Yugoslavia wanted further U.S. aid, it would have to break away from Yugoslavia and declare its independence. Okay, it's not a conspiracy theory, it's not my speculation, it's not my analysis, it's a public law. It's a public law. November 1990, the 1991 Foreign Appropriations Act. It's written right there. Go look at it. It required the U.S. State Department approval of election procedures and results in every one of the republics. It required that the republics do not hold national elections, but hold elections only in their own republics, and that the aid would go to individually to those republics. And when the aid did go, it went to those groups which the U.S. defined as democratic groups, which meant small right-wing ultra-nationalists and even fascistic parties. The ultimate goal was to break up Yugoslavia into a weak and helpless cluster of right-wing banana republics, privatized, deindustrialized. The U.S. decided to destroy, with the other Western powers decided to destroy Yugoslavia in 1989, when it became evident that it was the one country in Eastern Europe that would not voluntarily overthrow what remained of its socialist system. It was the one country that was still trying for some kind of economic independence outside of the world global free market third worldization process.
Former Canadian ambassador to Yugoslavia, John Bissett, stated the effort by European powers to defuse the growing tensions in Yugoslavia was wrecked by the United States government.
The people that started the war, the government that started the war, was the United States. There was a referendum in Bosnia about independence, and that was defeated. And my neighbor, who was the U.S. ambassador in Belgrade, who lived across the street from me, when an agreement was signed by all three religious groups that there would be peace in Bosnia and no declaration of independence without all three representatives being part of that, my neighbor, the U.S. ambassador Warren Zimmerman, went to Sarajevo and convinced the Muslim leader Izetbegovic to declare unilateral independence. And that he did, of course. And that was what started the war, because the 39 or 40% of the Serbian population there refused to accept the idea of living under Muslim law or Sharia law by the Muslim leadership. So the story goes back in history, of course, because those Serbs had been subject of the Islamic Turkish Empire for many centuries and had fought to free themselves from that. They did not want, in the middle of the 20th century, to once again have to live under Muslim rule. And that meant war. And everybody in the Balkans knew that meant war if the Muslims' Declaration of Independence was declared.
John Bissett,
so, you know, who really started the war?
Who really started the war? It has been a pleasure speaking with you. John Bissett, former Canadian ambassador to Yugoslavia.
The United States, with its NATO vassal states, managed to take control of the newly independent Yugoslav states, except the largest one, Serbia. Serbs were the largest ethnic group in Yugoslavia and fought the effort to destroy it. A massive propaganda campaign was launched to demonize Serbia to justify armed intervention. This was covered in a tale of the American Empire. The Empire bombed Serbia to seize Kosovo in 1999, linked in the description. Here is part. NATO unleashed a massive aerial bombardment without approval from the United States Congress nor the UN Security Council. Over 1,000 NATO warplanes destroyed bridges, factories, oil refineries, television stations, electrical stations, trains, and trucks hundreds of miles from Kosovo to pressure Serbian leaders to submit. The attacks were ruthless, like when an American F-15 fighter bombed a passenger train as it crossed a bridge, killing 55 civilians. The United States Air Force destroyed all 8 bridges over the large Danube River to cripple the Serbian economy. The last bridge standing was at Novi Sad. Local people camped out on the bridge thinking this would prevent its destruction, and dozens were killed when it was destroyed. The downed bridges blocked river traffic on the Danube for months, causing economic problems throughout the Balkans. After 3 weeks of bombing with over 650 aircraft sorties per day, air crews were exhausted, the bomb inventory was low, and reports of thousands of civilian deaths from the aerial bombing caused embarrassment. President Clinton declared victory and accepted the original offer that Serbia retain sovereignty over Kosovo. American President Bill Clinton is shown here visiting his empire's newest territory. NATO troops found no mass graves or proof of genocide that Clinton had warned about to justify his bombing campaign. Nevertheless, the United States began building a large military base in Kosovo called Camp Bondsteel. In 2008, American President George Bush announced that he would disregard the 1999 peace agreement and support an independent Kosovo protected by NATO. Russia and Serbia condemned this unilateral action. Russian President Vladimir Putin described the recognition of Kosovo's independence by the United States as, quote, a terrible precedent, which will de facto blow apart the whole system of international relations, developed not over decades, but over centuries, end quote. Most nations of the world have not recognized Kosovo, and frictions persist as NATO troops remain at Camp Bondsteel. The United States had used massive force to bomb the European state of Serbia without United Nations approval, and then violated a peace agreement to withdraw its national boundaries while establishing a new American military base in Serbia. This was blatantly illegal, but Serbia was not prepared to fight a war with NATO by attempting to reoccupy Kosovo. The UN peace mission departed Kosovo since President Bush had nullified the agreement. NATO then expanded into the Balkans. The destruction of Yugoslavia was successful and encouraged the empire to attempt a more ambitious effort, the destruction of Russia to break it into smaller states. Economic sanction warfare began, and terror groups were funded. A coup allowed the empire to take control of the nation of Georgia in 2003 and the nation of Ukraine in 2014, where a proxy war was provoked. This has failed to destroy Russia and caused huge problems for the empire's NATO vassal states, who may rebel and seek independence from the American empire.